35 years ago now, back during the hunting season of 1992, my buddy Josh and I drove out to Belmont County to try and bag ourselves a couple of wild turkeys for Thanksgiving, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 22, he was 23, and we both had jobs at a mill down in Wheeling, him on the line and me hauling scrap. And the pay wasn't great, but it kept the lights on and fridge stocked, and since we each worked 4 on and 4 off, it gave us plenty of time to head off hunting once the season started. That year, I told my mom that I'd bring a turkey over on Thanksgiving morning so she could have it stuffed and roasted come dinner time. But then, like I said, to save a couple of bucks, we figured that we'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone and turn what should have been a grocery store run into a hunting trip. Now, I had this old 78 F-150 at the time, a total rust bucket, but tough as an old boot, too. So after loading it up with our shotgun and cooler full of beers and cold cuts, we hit the road before dawn, heading east out into the woods before the sun had even risen. Now, we got to where we planned to park the truck just after dawn, a spot at the end of a dirt road which petered off at a thick patch of woods. Now, we'd been out there the year before, and Belmont's got the most perfect mix of rolling hills and oak-rich forest, which mean there'd be plenty of acorns dropping to fatten up those turkeys. Look into it. It gives them this natural flavor that the store-bought ones, I'll tell you, are lacking. Now, we were walking and talking, sipping on some coffee as the birds started getting pretty noisy. Then about a mile in, we threw together a blind with some camo netting and a bunch of larger fallen branches. Now, I had a box call with me, one that my grandpa actually carved, so for the first hour or so I kept on letting out the odd yelp or cluck type of sound, trying to sound like a lonely young hen. But the most we got was a few squirrels rustling around or the occasional deer snort off in the distance. Josh ended up cracking a joke about how we'd end up having to shoot a possum and call it a turkey when we get home. But then not even a couple of minutes later, we heard that first gobble echo over from a ridge. Now finally, after what felt like forever of us just sitting there freezing our nuts off, we spotted a small flock scratching their way through the underbrush about 50 yards ahead of us. Me and Josh are as excited as 2 little kids on Christmas Eve, watching them get closer and closer, totally none the wiser that we're sitting there behind all that camo netting. We waited, and then we waited some more. And then right when the time was right, I brought up my 12 gauge and then made this one turkey drop like a sack of potatoes as I got a really fine hit on him. Josh got another, but mine had been the bigger Tom, strutting all proud with his feathers fanned and his beard swinging. But all it took was one pull of my trigger, and he flopped off in a puff of feathers. Now, we traded a few high fives, got to dragging these birds back to the truck, which made for one heck of a workout, as I'm sure you're familiar, and then started on the field dressing then and there, and then so we wouldn't have to mess with it back home. Now, we were knee-deep in feathers and guts, squatting by the birds and trying to get them cleaned up before the sun got too high and warmed things up, because Lord knows poultry smells like ass when the warm air starts getting to it. Now, Josh started talking about how gutting turkeys made him wish that we stuck to fishing and how it's easier to gut certain kinds of fish than it is to get the wrapper off a Slim Jim. Now, that part made me laugh, and I turned to ask him what in the hell kind of Slim Jims he's been eating, but I didn't get a chance to get the words out, because before I even opened my mouth, a bullet flew over our heads and a shot rang out. Now, I think it was a tree that stopped the bullet, but I can't be certain. All I heard was this chunk sort of sound as it landed somewhere behind us. And both me and Josh just froze up for a second. And while I can't tell you what he was thinking at that moment, I couldn't imagine why anyone might shoot at us, so I assumed it was an accident of some kind. Now, we were both crouched still as I yelled out something, "What the hell? Hey, dumbass, watch your aim!" Now, I didn't really figure it was just some idiot greenhorn who couldn't tell a turkey call from the goddamn echo of one, and I expected to hear an apology, but instead, we got nothing. No answer at all. Just the wind rustling dead leaves. And then suddenly, another crack split the air, and a second bullet hit even closer than the first. When it kicked up a clump of dirt no more than 3 feet away from Josh's boot, we both screamed and ran for cover behind the truck. For a second, I thought I could run for my gun, which by then was leaning up against a log nearby. But I was also pretty sure grabbing it meant giving whoever was out there a very clear shot of me, so I realized pretty quickly that we had no choice but to stay crouched and hope the shooter didn't have an angle on us. Now, Josh kept trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it only took a couple of seconds for us to figure out that, at the very least, he wasn't behind us. He was somewhere out there in front of us and on the other side of that truck. Now, the best we could do was look out into the truck's side mirror and hope that we could catch a muzzle flash or something should the shooter choose to fire again. Josh leaned down at one point too, trying to peek out under the truck, but I told him to stop being so dumb before he got his freaking head shot off. He then tried reaching for his gun, and I swear I thought I was about to watch him take a bullet right then and there, but he managed to reach and grab it without the shooter firing a third time. And that's what gave us hope that whoever had fired had just simply ran off, so after a couple of more minutes of waiting there, we decided to make a break for it. We counted off a quiet 3, then scrambled up and dived into the truck, leaving those half-dressed turkeys laying there as we sped off as fast as we could. I didn't even think about going for my gun, not while Josh had his. And then while leaning over in the seat so as not to expose myself through the windshield, I started up the truck's engine, and off we went with the wheels spinning and not even bothering to close the doors. I kept waiting for a shot to shatter the windshield or ping off the tailgate, but there was nothing but the sound of my engine as we hauled ass down that dirt road. We didn't slow down until we hit the highway, but even then, it took another couple of miles before our hearts stopped pounding like they were fixing to explode. And we drove right over to the county sheriff's office, so wired on adrenaline and how surreal it all was that we forgot to wash the blood off of our hands. One of the deputies later joked that he thought we'd walk in to confess a murder and hadn't ever been so relieved in his life when we said it was turkey blood and he saw the little white feathers caked in the mud on our boots. Now, once we got as clean as we could in the department bathroom, we both sat down with the deputy I mentioned and walked him through the whole insane ordeal. It felt like talking about a dream, like it all happened so fast and it made such little sense that describing it all to that deputy felt almost like I was talking about someone else. The deputy took our statements, asked us a bunch of questions, mainly on the location of where it all happened, and that's when leaving the turkeys behind became a good thing because if the cops found 2 half-dressed turkeys, then they had our spot. The deputy told us that they'd send a patrol out to check, but with it being hunting season, he was betting on it being anything from a stray bullet to some fool playing games. And to us, it felt way more personal than that. But we also figured that the sheriff's department would do a better job figuring it all out than we ever could. And I guess they did exactly that too, as it took them a couple of years. After we gave our statements, Josh and I grabbed some coffee at a gas station, and he talked me out of going back to where he'd been shot at so I could retrieve my shotgun. Although if I had chosen to go back, I'd have found what the deputies did a couple of days later, which was 2 half-dressed turkeys, but no shotgun. And that's what was real creepy, thinking whoever shot at us hadn't run off or run out of ammunition or whatever. They took 2 shots, then watched us drive off, all scared before walking up on where we'd been and stealing my gun. And the whole thing sure did ruin a good hunt, that's for damn sure, and my mother ended up buying a store-bought turkey which tasted like cardboard compared to what we could have had. Now it felt like we'd lost something even bigger than those turkeys and that shotgun. We just never realized how lucky we'd really been until about 3 years later. So, during the summer of 1993, a man named Thomas Dillon was convicted of 5 murders, all of which took place in eastern and southern Ohio. As you can imagine, it was huge news, but it wasn't the number of bodies or even where they killed which really got mine and Josh's attention. It was how this guy killed his victims. Because he didn't stab them or bludgeon them to death, he shot them instead. But he did it from a distance and with a long rifle, like he was hunting people. I heard it from Josh before I put it together myself, and when he called, it was the only time in my life where I genuinely felt my legs turn to jelly. I remember sitting back down on the couch with the phone in my hands thinking, holy crap, We got shot at by a serial killer, and we could have been two of his victims. Again, we didn't know how lucky we really were because I think maybe 4 or 5 days later after our hunting trip, Tom Dillon killed a kid just a few years younger than us in almost the exact same spot. Now, he didn't just destroy lives by killing people either, and there's no way that he killed just 5. In fact, there was such a strong evidence that Dillon had killed 2 hunters in Michigan in the same year that we got shot at that another person falsely accused of killing them was let out of jail after spending 18 years in a cell. Now, that'll never fail to be crazy to me how this guy managed to ruin the lives of people he'd never even met, and how by some miracle I narrowly avoided being one of his victims. I grew up in a little town in Barber County, West Virginia during the late 50s and early 60s. Now, it was a lot like you might expect. Really poor, very family-oriented, and lots of Jesus Christ. There were a lot of backyard vegetable patches, people made a lot of homemade wine and liquor, and if you couldn't afford to put meat on the table, well, you went out and hunted it for yourself. I know of certain college towns that are crazy over football, but around here in Bellington and Alston, hunting was very much the local pastime. Now, I guess it carried on from the Great Depression, and it was very much a rite of passage for young men like myself to head out with their paws and grandpas and try to bag a deer. We learned hunting safety as early as elementary school and how you never went out into the woods during hunting season without blazing orange somewhere on your uppers. Now, we were also raised to have respect for the men who put their bodies on the line to feed their families and neighbors, because Lord knows you get a heck of a lot of meat out of a full-grown deer. And so when 2 hunters from around Bellington went missing back when I was 12, I remember it being a really big deal. My dad joined one of the search parties that went out looking for the 2 missing men, who turned out to be 2 regular hunting partners named Mo and Larry. Now, they used to get called the 2 Stooges on account of them lacking a curly, but no one made that joke after they disappeared. And after that, it was just poor Mo and Larry, or those missing hunters. Working with local cops, men from all over Barber County mounted 3 different search attempts, each one combing over the wooded hills near a place called Stringtown. Now, not a single trace of either hunter was ever found. We used to pray for them every Sunday in church, pray that they'd return home and safe and sound one day, having come back from wherever they were. But after a while, folks started to accept the cold, hard truth that both Mo and Larry were probably dead. As a kid, I remember finding it all very confusing. There was no sign of what you might call foul play, which gave folks a lot of hope. And then when the searchers didn't find any bodies, people started talking like Mo and Larry were just on vacation or decided to leave town for some reason. Now, I remember why they'd do something like that, just up and leave town without telling anybody. And there were all kinds of rumors too, just nothing anybody talked about in public and nothing that fit neither. But then one day, there was suddenly a little memorial outside the church, and I saw Mo and Larry's families all dressed in black on 2 consecutive weekends. One day they were just off someplace, then the next, they were gone for good. This was many years after they went missing, and I later learned that Mo and Larry's families decided to declare them dead in absentia for legal and financial reasons, but doing that meant giving up on them and accepting that they were gone. And then, when the town finally accepted that Mo and Larry were really dead, and not just missing, it was like this whole second wave of grief that I remember much clearer on account of being older. Now, I guess it was how everyone was feeling for Mo and Larry's kids, because they left 2 widows, but 5 orphans. It twisted people up inside to see so many kids grieving like that, having all that hope ripped away from them after it kept them warm for so many years. And then people got bitter and mad and started looking for someone or something to blame. Now, it was at a town meeting when someone suggested the volunteer search teams hadn't done their jobs properly, and all hell broke loose. There was a lot of yelling back and forth, and I remember Dad switching from beer to whiskey that evening as he sat on the porch watching the night roll on. He was talking to just about anyone who'd listen, and he told me all about how there was something off about how the search went on, how Mo and Larry should have been boots on the ground, but how it was just like they just hopped in a truck and took off somewhere. Now that wasn't out of the question, but the issue of why bothered some more than others. Some of those nasty rumors I mentioned involved Mo and Larry batting for the other team, so to speak, meaning some treated the disappearance like it was radioactive and didn't want to touch it. But then other folks, my dad included, had a way more frightening idea, one that involved poor Mo and Larry being forced into said truck against their will, as in, at gunpoint. According to my dad, all liquored up on the porch that night, there was no way in hell either man would just abandon their wives and kids like that, not without at least a note on the kitchen table. And if they'd been murdered out there, there'd be some shred of evidence to prove that they weren't all in one piece, be it a scrap of clothing or a scrap of them. And then according to my pop, anyone who said he and his boys didn't look hard enough were liars, because they turned over every leaf in those woods looking for Mo and Larry twice over, and they didn't find squat. It was just a real sad state of affairs, and the whole thing hung over the town for years and years and years. And then one day, the county sheriff comes to visit Mo and Larry's widows and starts asking them all kinds of questions about any business that they might have had with two farmers over in Tucker County. Neither widow knew what they were talking about, so they had nothing to share. But when they asked if there had been any developments in their search for their missing husbands, the sheriff gave them chicken feed, and that he was just talking to some farmers over there in Tucker about the disappearances. Well, he wasn't just talking to anyone over in Tucker. He was working with the sheriff's office over there and digging up whole patches of land on this hog farm owned by these two brothers. It took a couple of days for word to spread across county lines, but when it did, someone from Alston drove over to see it for themselves. Lo and behold, the cops were all still there, stripped to the waist with shovels and pickaxes, shoveling their way through mountains of dirt. They were looking for something all right, and by that stage, it had to be Mo and Larry's bodies. But since they refused to make any announcements regarding what they were doing, there was an uproar back home in Bellington. Folks wanted to know what the hell they were doing out there digging up some hog farm, or more specifically, what kind of tip-off they'd received that led them to put all that work into digging the place up. It was radio silence for weeks on end, and then when the Barber County Sheriff finally told folks what he was doing, they were even less happy than before. He said it was some kind of anonymous tip-off and that the whole dig had amounted to nothing, but people didn't believe a word of it. They didn't believe that they'd dig up a whole farm based on nothing but a tip. But the cops wouldn't budge. They said that there was nothing more to be done regarding that avenue of investigation, and there'd be more updates as and when they rolled in. But there were no updates, there was no news, and neither Mo nor Larry, bodies or otherwise, were ever found. The mystery of what happened to those two hunters stayed hanging over Bellington for as long as I lived there, and since I don't imagine people have forgotten about them, I don't imagine that dark cloud's about to disappear anytime soon. In what was very much a spur-of-the-moment decision, I decided to join the British Army when I was 18. I'd fallen in with a bad group of lads back home, and after almost dying on the road one night while we were all drunk, I knew something had to change. Now, the Army should have given my dad a recruitment bounty because it was him that talked me into it. I could learn some discipline, get fit, earn a wage, and shoot a few guns while I was at it, and that was all he needed to say. I ended up an infantryman in the Cheshires, which is what we called the Cheshire Regiment at the arse end of the Cold War. It was all Russia, Russia, Russia back then, so not much has changed, I suppose. But then the USSR fell apart, and suddenly we had no one to fight. Things were looking up, and for young soldiers like myself, it seemed like we'd be spending the rest of our careers in peacetime. But then, not even a year after the USSR went tits up, another Eastern European country decided to crap the bed, and this time, it was Yugoslavia. Now, long story short, Yugoslavia was a country made up of people who hated each other's guts, and the only thing keeping a lid on it all was a dictatorship. But then when that fell apart, everything kicked off. There were massacres, sieges, bombings, you name it. And then the UN decided a peacekeeping force should go in to stop it, and that's how we ended up in a place called Sarajevo. Being the biggest city in all of Bosnia, it had the highest concentration of people in the whole country living there, and when the war kicked off, it was immediately surrounded by Serbian forces. They tried to take the city, but the Serb assault force was massively outnumbered by the Bosnian defenders, so the assault failed. And that's when the siege started, and it didn't let up for almost 4 years. By the time we arrived, Sarajevo was one of the most dangerous places on planet Earth. There were rocket and mortar barrages, both incoming and outgoing, sniper duels between Serbs and Bosnians, and sometimes both water and power would be shut off for weeks at a time, which made the city smell like an unwashed arse in the summer. It was hell on earth, and it was impossible for your heart not to break for the civilians forced to live there. People lost family every single day, like when the Serbs sent a single 120mm mortar shell into a crowded marketplace one day. More than 200 people were either hurt or killed just from that one little shell, and the Serbs did it on purpose. Their snipers had the same strategy and didn't restrict themselves to uniformed soldiers or even armed civilians. If they could see you, you were fair game, and I'll never ever forget watching a Serb sniper gun down this lone elderly woman as she tried to cross the street one day. The shelling was horrendously scary, but the Serbs were using old Soviet kits, so for the most part, it wasn't very accurate. But the thing we really worried about were the snipers, especially the good ones. They could get much closer than the mortar or rocket crews, and I'd say about 50% of the time, if they had you in their sights, you were done for. And it's a story about a sniper that I've got for you today. So, in April of 1993, my section and I had been given the job of guarding an intersection in our 2 armored vehicles. Jobs like that are usually quite boring. This one was the polar opposite. And aside from the already 300 artillery and mortar shells which hit Sarajevo on a daily basis, the snipers were incredibly ballsy. But while me and my section mates were safe in our armored cars, civilians, especially the old or infirm, were incredibly vulnerable to their fire. We kept watch, but it was also our job to provide mobile cover to civilians should they come under fire. Then, if possible, and without undue danger to innocent life, we would return fire until the incoming ceased and the snipers fled. Where we were stationed, we managed to identify 4 different snipers based on the location of their firing points and the caliber of ammunition they used. It wasn't a foolproof method, like they didn't shoot at us and we'd be like, "Oh, that's Dave," but we could usually figure it out pretty quickly. So when one day we had someone open up on us from a brand new firing point in a derelict high-rise, we reckoned that a brand new player had joined the game. And he must have been brand new because his shooting was shite. The first time this new sniper shot at us, we didn't think it actually was directed at us. It wasn't until the second shot landed a bit closer that we realized that we were the target. We did our usual thing and returned fire after identifying the fire point. Now, all it took was a bit of machine gun fire and then our checkpoint went quiet again. The next day, the same thing happened again, and we got shot at from the same place, and the shots were so inaccurate that we honestly felt embarrassed for whoever was up there pulling the trigger. But then the third day, the sniper started targeting civilians and not just our armored cars. So with one of us providing cover, the other car rushed off towards what turned out to be the derelict apartment building to flush out that sniper. I was with the car who stayed back to provide cover to the civilians, so I didn't get to see all of this. But the lads in the other car said that when they found the abandoned apartment the sniper had been using, it was empty. There were casings all over the floor, alongside a small hole in the wall that overlooked our position. So while they might have been a terrible shot, they were pretty good at picking fire points, meaning it was only a matter of time before a bullet finally hit its target. Knowing the situation was akin to a ticking time bomb here, with a derelict high-rise being much closer than the surrounding hills, our sergeant asked our troop commander if we should set up a listening post in an adjacent flat. A car full of lads could sneak up there before dawn, take a concealed position up, and then when the snipers fired, boom, they'd pounce. When the boss okayed it, we were chuffed to the bits. We'd been sitting on our arses getting shot at for weeks, and with F all to show for it, so as you can imagine, we were well up for getting our own back. Now, the next morning, the wagons arrived at the checkpoint, but only mine was occupied. The other only had its driver because the lads who normally occupied it had their listening post set up in the high-rise. We waited, and we waited, checking in with each other every so often. Then around 11 that morning, our radio man up in the listening post started tapping on his receiver. And none of us needed to figure out the code that he was tapping out to know someone was in the building with them. We were all on tenterhooks waiting for something to happen, and when it did, we were relieved to hear none of our blokes were hurt after the shooting stopped. Our lads up in the high-rise had taken down 2/3 of a 3-man sniper team, most likely belonging to a Serb militia by the looks of them. The third, who was unarmed, dropped to his knees and begged for his life. And seeing as a prisoner would be handy, the lads brought him back to the checkpoint with his arms tied behind his back. But before that, we heard something over the radios that had us right shocked. So, after our lads killed 2/3 of the sniper team, then took the third bloke prisoner, they searched the bodies of the 2 dead men to see what they had on them. They had a bit of money on them, cigarettes, lighters, bits and pieces like that. But then in the pocket of one dead man, our section mates found a passport. An Italian passport. They obviously compared the picture to the dead man's face just to make sure it was really him. But there was no mistake. The now deceased sniper did indeed seem to be an Italian citizen, and not one of Serbian extraction either, if his name was anything to go by. The Serb we captured had a load of cash on him, so at first we thought the Italians might have been mercenaries of some description. But once we got hold of someone who spoke Serbian to act as a translator, the captured Serb told a very different story. It was one I didn't believe at the time, but after seeing the article I've attached to this email, I realized that he might well have been telling the truth all along. Through the translator, and having sweetened him up with some ciggies, water, and a little ration packs, our Serb prisoner was only too willing to tell us what was going on. And when he did, we were shocked. The 2 Italians hadn't been mercenaries, which made sense since the Serbs weren't exactly flush with cash. Instead, it was them that had been paying the Serbs for a chance to shoot at UN soldiers and Bosnian civilians. And we couldn't believe our ears, and neither could our translator, because at one point, their expression went from deadpan to very, very confused. We asked the woman to double-check for us and get the man to confirm that what he was organizing was effectively war tourism. The Serb said that he was just following orders and had no choice but to do as his commander told him, or it'd be him who got a bullet. He couldn't tell us much about the Italians that he was escorting, only that they had a lot of money with them and they knew absolutely sod all about soldiering. My words, not his. Now, when all was said and done, we had little choice but to report evidence of war tourism to our troop commander. He was shocked, just as we'd been, especially once we showed him the Italian passport we'd found on the dead man. But frustratingly, we needed a lot more than just one man's word and a passport to prove an accusation like war tourism, and that's aside from the fact that it's not strictly a war crime. Our sergeant asked if it was worth going back to collect the 2 men's bodies, but our troop commander didn't think it was worth the risk. If it was true, and those 2 Italians were tourists paying good money to kill people, then they'd already received the most suitable punishment possible. Our lieutenant also said that there was very little chance the Italians would even claim them. They'd say the passports were forged, that no good Italian would ever do such a thing, and they might actually be right too. The passports might have been forged, and the blokes we'd killed had actually been Russian advisors or something, but that contradicted what the Serb prisoner had told us, but the boss was basically right. We didn't actually know anything about the 2 blokes that had been killed in the high-rise, and there were much more pressing matters at hand than identifying 2 idiots who strayed into a war zone. And that's where it stayed. Officially nothing but rumor for more than 30 years, and then an old mate of mine sent me the Al Jazeera article that I've included in this email, and my jaw just about hit the floor. I suppose I should briefly summarize what it says so your audience knows what I'm on about. But long story short, there's an Italian journalist who's gathered so much evidence of what he calls sniper safaris that an Italian prosecutor had brought the case to court. The journalist reckons it was advertised among darker corners of Italian society, most likely with mafia involvement, and that participants paid what today would be worth about 100,000 euros or about $120,000 US. Now, we weren't the only soldiers to notice it happening either, because according to that Italian journo, a Bosnian intelligence officer reached out to his Italian counterparts and asked them to put a stop to it. People in Sarajevo had apparently long suspected that there had been sniper safaris, as in foreigners paying vast amounts for the chance to shoot at them. One person quoted in the article says that the snipers always seem more active on weekends, which implies people flying over on the Friday and then leaving again on the Sunday evening, which is exactly what an unnamed plastic surgeon was said to have done back in 1993, the same year I was there. The article doesn't mention anything about any tourists losing their lives, but I suppose it's implied, isn't it? Not all the rounds were incoming. We fired back quite a few at the Serbs from inside Sarajevo, so I wouldn't be surprised if even more sniper safaris came under fire and ended up paying $100,000 for the privilege of losing their lives. Unsurprisingly, I don't have much sympathy for them. It was us that they were shooting at, but having it all but confirmed for us gave me mixed feelings. I suppose I just didn't want to think about people being capable of stuff like that. People who saw a terrible tragedy unfolding and thought, I can take advantage of that. And it's not just about making money on war, though that is bad enough, but to be capable of taking someone's life, a total stranger at that, and then getting away with it, scot-free. Buongiorno. My name is Laurent, and I'm from Charleroi here in Belgium, and I believe I have a story you may be interested in. Now, it's not a personal story of a frightening experience, but rather a story that is personal to me that frightens me very much to even think about. Now, perhaps that is my English failing me, in which case I beg your pardon. But all will become clear as this email progresses, and I promise it'll be worth your time to read. My grandfather, Leandro, was born in 1899 and spent his formative years being educated or working on my great-grandfather's farm. He planned on attending university with an aim of becoming a doctor, but the Great War changed many destinies. He was too young to serve in the army during the First War, then volunteered as a junior officer shortly prior to the outbreak of the Second. Yet the speed at which Germany invaded Belgium meant that his unit was overrun and he was forced to flee to Britain to become part of the Free Belgian Forces. His dream was to be present in the army that retook his homeland, but instead, the government in exile had other plans and sent him to the Congo. Now, despite its motherland being overrun by Germans, the Belgian colony of the Congo remained in Free Belgian hands. Yet the government was in dire need of people to aid in the country's colonial administration, which is why my grandfather was given the job. He traveled to the Congo in 1940, spent 5 years living and working there, and then when the war ended and it was time to return home, my grandfather refused. He claimed to have not only found a home away from home, but also a private enterprise by which he could richly support himself, and that of a hunting guide. Grandpa was based in a place called Kisangani, which is a city in the eastern portion of Congo's central basin that is surrounded by dense rainforests and jungles. Many wealthy Belgian and French hunters used to visit Kisangani and would pay vast amounts to hunting guides who could safely lead hunts for forest buffalo, red-coasted bongo, or the semi-aquatic Sitatunga antelope. Now, my grandfather had been an avid hunter both at home and in the Congo. So after risking his life for the freedom and liberty of all, he decided a life of leisure was in order and began a hunting enterprise so he could profit from his passions. My father and aunt would travel out to visit him in the winter times, and they witnessed firsthand how their father funded their lavish lifestyles back home in Charleroi. and my grandfather hosted a great number of Belgian and French celebrities, as well as diplomats and foreign dignitaries. He would throw extravagant parties with drinks and dancing after returning upriver with his clients from the hunting grounds. I have seen many photographs from those times, and to me he seemed like a happy, fun-loving, and remarkably unserious person. But that all ended in 1960 when a period of violent instability culminated in the Congo gaining independence from colonial rule. Many Belgians returned to their motherland, including my grandfather, but according to my father, his return marked a dramatic shift in his personality. Gone was the fun-loving, field sports-loving socialite who hunted by day and partied by night, and instead, a dour and bitter man had taken his place. My father and aunt were grown-ups by this time and didn't live in the large family home anymore, but they heard stories from my grandmother regarding the change in her husband's demeanor. He would sequester himself in his study for days on end, sleeping and taking his meals there too, and for months he lived like that, studying thick tomes and poring over maps before he finally shared the details of his affliction with my grandmother. Now, for the previous year, a business partner of his had gone missing in the field, and since the struggle for independence had slowed the process of his recovery, my grandfather had been forced to organize the search effort from thousands of miles away, and the process was clearly taking its toll. My grandmother didn't press him on the subject, but as the effort to recover his business partner stretched into 1961 and 1962, it was clear that the search was no longer for a living person, but potentially for their body. But then, in early 1963, my grandfather seemed to become very excited after obtaining new evidence of his partner's whereabouts. He flew to Congo just weeks later and spent around 10 weeks in the jungle searching for his partner. My grandmother said she prayed nightly for his success, and upon receiving news of his failure, she prayed that he would find a way to live with it. Yet instead of returning home in grief, having written an end to yet another sad and chaotic period of his life, his return marked the beginning of a brand new one, marked by madness, superstition, and social withdrawal. He began importing Minkisi statuettes from the Lengola tribespeople who inhabited the lands east and south of Kisangani. He imported them by the dozens, the quantity of which I have witnessed with my own eyes, but Minkisi are not mere decorative pieces. In fact, they have sometimes been described as portable graves. If a person takes even a clump of soul from the grave of a deceased person and passes it over or places it inside of a Minkisi, then the soul of the deceased can travel wherever the statue goes. Grandpa Leandro has these Minkisi guardians installed over windows and doors, but never explained whether this was to keep something in or to keep something out of his house. Now, my grandfather also oversaw the installation of what he called an ancestral altar in his study, but this he chose to explain. He kept it stocked with offerings like fresh water and fruits, or drew symbols on it in red chalk so that the spirits of the dead might linger and offer him guidance. My grandfather also kept bowls of river stones in his home and ordered a pond to be dug on his lands so that Simbi water spirits might make their home there. The Simbi are spirits which guard nature and ferry souls between life and death. Perhaps it was his advanced age that sparked such a fascination with them, but each of the fountains, bird baths, and even some of the water taps in his home bore images of Simbi. Yet I think it was their reputation for warning of danger which truly occupied my grandfather's mind. And that was how he spent his final years, fixated on antediluvian Congolese religion and living out his study like some kind of wealthy hermit. My grandmother said that, at first, Grandpa Leandro would only draw his strange chalk symbols around the ancestral altar in his study, but as he drew closer and closer to death, they began appearing in other areas of their home and with increasing frequency. But unlike the red symbols, which he believed invoked good health and longevity, these later symbols were only ever in white, which denoted communication with the spirit world. He grew more and more agitated as his health began to fail him. The presence of owls on his property frightened him terribly, since he firmly believed that they were an omen of death. My grandmother said that in the days before Grandpa Leandro passed, he seemed incredibly agitated and scatterbrained. He began demanding that she summon what he called a nanga, which is essentially a Congolese witch doctor, so they might perform death rites on him. My grandmother suffered terribly in her belief that her husband's mind was fracturing, but did as he wished and found a nanga in form of an elderly Congolese housemaid who lived in Brussels. My grandmother feared the woman's presence would only further agitate her dying husband, but instead, he appeared calm and lucid as the nanga chanted and performed her rituals. My grandmother said it was a transformation. Whatever that woman said or did with him, it brought a frightened and paranoid man to peace, and then a few days later, he died. I was in my early 20s when he passed away, and until then, I had been shielded from most of his madness with the explanation that he was very eccentric and very ill. But after he died and my grandmother could no longer maintain the veneer of wellness, I found out everything I've written about and more in a whirlwind week of revelations. Now, as you can probably tell, I ended up doing a great deal of my own personal research into my grandfather's beliefs in the hopes that it might shed some light on the man's mind. But for every answer I obtain prompts only more questions and only deepens the mystery. My grandfather was something of a documentarian in his way, and I have already touched on the photo albums full of pictures of his lavish parties and prominent hunting clients. Now, he also kept many diaries of his service in the Congo, both private and public. But when it comes to information regarding his missing business partner, a South African gentleman named Francois, there was a frustrating and rather alarming absence. I found plenty of maps and invoices regarding the transportation of expeditionary equipment, but absolutely nothing on the circumstances of Francois' disappearances, or what happened on the attempt to recover him which took place in 1963. Discovering what happened on this trip is nothing short of pivotal to explaining my grandfather's beliefs and his state of mind, yet I am at a complete loss to explain it. And in the absence of explanations, I find myself entertaining some very frightening ideas. My grandfather was a great man, and for a time he was a happy one, but something happened to one of his oldest and closest friends, and I don't think it was the mystery of it that drove my grandfather mad. I think it was the truth. I think something horrifying beyond reason happened to my grandfather's friend, something that only ancient religion and superstition could bring him comfort. And despite my best efforts to uncover what that thing is, I find myself wondering, do I really want to know the truth? The same truth which stole his sanity. I've been an employee of the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission for almost 10 years now, and while I love my job, it's hard going sometimes. Now, to cut a long story short, we're the agency responsible for taking care of the state's wildlife, along with the various habitats that they call home. Now, it's also our job to issue licenses to hunters that we deem safe and responsible, and we handle a lot of the educational materials regarding stuff like hunting and boating safety. Now, we also run conservation programs to ensure the state's natural beauty can be enjoyed for generations to come. But it's not all rubber stamps and giving lectures to elementary school kids. There's a dark side to the job, and that dark side mostly consists of investigating hunting accidents. Our wildlife officers investigate reports of animal attacks, but also accidents like tree stand falls, and then we try to integrate what we learn into prevention programs so repeat incidents don't occur. But in more severe cases, especially those involving criminal negligence, which, God forbid, result in fatalities, we coordinate with local law enforcement for more thorough probes. Now, I've been unfortunate enough to have been involved in about 24 investigations of that nature, and each and every one of them involving serious injury or loss of life were both physically and mentally challenging. But there's only one such incident that manages to send shivers down my spine, even all these years later, and it's this one. Just over 6 years ago, we got a call one day from the Marion County Sheriff's Department saying that there had been a real nasty hunting accident up near a place called Yellville. Accidents are rare, so we were shocked just to get a call like that, but once we heard the details, we just about had to pick up our damn jaws off the floor afterwards. Apparently, there had been 2 hunters out in the woods, and they'd been stalking this old buck for hours and hours. They'd noticed it had been acting a little funny while they'd been trailing it, but nothing too out of the ordinary, so they kept on its tail till they had themselves a decent shot. Now, one of the hunters lines up his sights, takes his shot, and the buck goes down. But then instead of walking straight over there to take their pictures and haul it away, they stopped, watched, and waited. You see, hunters can't just walk up to their kills after they go down because sometimes the deer is just stunned and can wake up and choose violence as soon as the hunters start poking and prodding around. Our safety briefs advise folks to wait at least 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the animal and where the shot landed. This way they can ensure their prey is passed on and won't be a threat to them during trophy pictures or transportation. Our 2 hunters up near Yellville weren't cowboys either, so I believe them when they said that they waited for the full 30 before approaching their kill. And then after standing over it for a minute or so and making damn sure that the thing wasn't breathing anymore, they started fixing to take some pictures. But then no sooner had one of the hunters kneeled down behind it, the buck that they were quite certain was dead suddenly leapt to its feet and gored the man closest to it really, really bad. He suffered 3 very serious puncture wounds to his stomach and chest, and since it was all close quarters chaos, his buddy didn't have the time or the accuracy to shoulder his rifle and try to put the buck down again. Luckily, the thing took off just as fast once it gored the guy to the ground, so he didn't receive any additional injuries. But unfortunately, his buddy's shot missed. Now, I never rejoice when an animal is killed. It was frustrating not getting our hands on its body so we could further analyze it and potentially figure out how it appeared to come back to life all aggressive like that. A lot of figuring out what's going on with flora or fauna ends up in a lab, so no samples meant no answers. But the most important thing was that our wounded hunter was airlifted to a hospital where the doctors managed to save his life. Now, some said it was nothing short of a miracle considering the damage that buck's antlers had done. But if you notice, folks never seem to question the miracles. It's always the mysteries that keep them up at night. And the mystery in this case was how in the world that buck had jumped to its feet after 2 experienced hunters were so sure that it was dead. Now, after we talked with the wounded hunter and his partner, I was one of the wildlife officers dispatched to the scene. It was eerie as all heck out there, just knowing that we were in a place where something like that had happened. But since the buck in question was already shot, we figured it'd only be a matter of time before we found it laid out somewhere, dead as a doornail. But we searched for hours, up and down in every direction, and we didn't find so much as a pile of poop, and that didn't make a lick of sense. Now, our wounded hunter said that his aim was good, and he put a bullet through both that buck's lungs. But if that was the case, now we should have found it dead within less than a mile of the incident site. Now, by the end of our search, me and the other wildlife officers had ourselves a really bad case of the willies, wondering how in the world the supposedly dead buck had the strength to inflict such damage to our hunter and then ran off without keeling over after only a couple of steps. One of the tasks that we were issued after the fact was to figure out how we could incorporate lessons into our hunter education programs and habitat management strategies to hopefully help prevent similar tragedies. But when it came to it, I had no idea what in the hell I was going to write. The hunters did exactly what we asked in terms of giving their prey a wide berth after their kill. So apart from something akin to try not to shoot one of them, their zombie deers, there was nothing much I could say in terms of safety or prevention. All we were left with were a series of unanswered questions, and pretty damn creepy ones at that. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.